2 weeks ago, when Gilad Shalit was released, the morning of his release, my wife Sarah called me urgently out to the porch, and she said, "You've got to see this." We live, as Seth mentioned, in Jerusalem, in a neighborhood called French Hill, the very edge of Jerusalem next to Mount Scopus. And we live in the last row of houses in French Hill, so that when you look out, you see the Dead Sea, the Judean desert. You also see the Palestinian village of Isawiya, which is literally next door to French Hill, maybe 1,000 meters away. And I went out to the porch, and we saw clearly from where we were standing hundreds of Palestinians celebrating, waving flags, and banging drums. It turns out that 2 of the terrorists released in the exchange happened to come from Isawiya. So the neighbors are back. And what we saw from the porch, what was most sobering of all, were enormous Hamas flags flying over the houses of Isawiya. I don't know how quite to convey the enormity of that experience, the intimacy of the conflict as it's brought home literally to your porch. And what hit home for me that day in the most personal way possible was a growing sense that many of us feel in Israel, more perhaps abstractly, but nevertheless a sense of growing siege, that the borders of Israel are almost closing in, a sense of the hostility of the region, which we usually manage to keep at bay, beginning to encroach and impinge. One can conceive of Israel's dilemma in terms of concentric circles of siege. The innermost circle pressing in against our borders are the 2 terror enclaves that have been established in the last decade, both as a result of unilateral withdrawals, first from southern Lebanon in 2000, then from Gaza in 2005, into which a vacuum that was formed, into which 2 Islamist movements stepped in and created terror positions on our borders, Hamas and Hezbollah, and in so doing, undermined a decades-long Israeli strategic commitment, which was shared by governments of left and right. And that strategic commitment posited that no terror enclave would be allowed to take root on Israel's borders, with easy access to Israel's population centers. The first Lebanon war was fought to push back the PLO from southern Lebanon. The settlements policy in the West Bank was also aimed at preventing a PLO state from being established on Israel's borders. The open bridges policy of Moshe Dayan in the early 70s between the West Bank and Jordan was likewise intended to try to prevent a PLO state emerging there. So that for decades, both Labor and Likud governments shared the same policy. And now we are seeing the effective collapse of a 4 decades long strategic commitment. Now, not only are we facing 2 terror enclaves on our borders, but both are, of course, clients of Iran. So that effectively, Iran is no longer at a remove, but has become a direct confrontation state through its 2 proxies. There are an estimated 160,000 missiles aimed at the Israeli home front. Again, an unprecedented moment in Israeli history. These missiles are part of an arsenal belonging to Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran. The four factors that are likely to be engaged in direct confrontation with Israel if there is another regional war. At the same time, we have experienced a new sense of vulnerability on our southern border, our long southern border with Egypt. Many of you know that for the last 35 years, we have felt so confident about the peace with Egypt that we didn't even build a fence on that southern border. It is the only one of our borders that remains open. And that border, of course, is now in the process, very quickly, of being sealed. And that sealing represents a psychological shift within the Israeli strategic community, which now regards Egypt as a potential confrontation state in another war. Beyond the immediate impingement of this inner circle of siege, there is, of course, an outer circle of siege, most importantly, Iran and its nuclear threat. And I would add parenthetically that this is likely the last year that is possible to stop a nuclear Iran. Now, we in Israel have been saying this for years, that we're about to reach the point of no return. And we now know that one reason why the point of no return was continually delayed was because of effective sabotage efforts within Iran. It appears that our bag of tricks is empty, and that the opportunity to stop Iran through continued acts of subterfuge like the Stuxnet virus or the assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists is becoming increasingly untenable, and in all likelihood, the only way to stop Iran will be a military strike. Now, joining this outer circle of siege, joining Iran, in effect, in the last months, of course, is Turkey. Bear in mind that Turkey and Iran were once, at different times, Israel's closest regional allies, our closest allies in the Muslim world. Today, Iran, of course, is our most dangerous enemy, and Turkey is vying with Iran, the two non-Arab Muslim powers in the region, are vying for domination of the Arab world. And Turkey now, of course, is playing the Israel card in competition with Iran. Now, the Arab Spring has effectively turned Israelis into the curmudgeons of the world. Because while the rest of the world, or certainly the rest of the West, is celebrating the apparent or supposed rise of democracy in the Arab world, we in Israel were warning that what we see is not necessarily Prague 1989, but perhaps more likely Tehran 1979. And just how lonely it is to be an Israeli, and by extension to be part of the pro-Israel community, because I think many of you feel this way as well. Just how lonely it is to be holding this skeptical position in relation to the Arab Spring was brought home to me by an article I read just recently in the Wall Street Journal by Matt Kaminsky. Matt Kaminsky is on the editorial board of the Journal, a terrific commentator, a deep friend of Israel. And Matt was sent by the Journal to Tunisia to report on the elections there, and wrote a series of pieces that were cautiously optimistic. And reading Matt Kaminsky from Tunisia, writing about how there is a new Islamist movement developing in Tunisia, and that Tunisia, because of its unique history and culture may be able to create a different kind of model Islamism. He even dared to use the term moderate Islamism, and he wrote that I realize this is a potential problem. Nevertheless, he allowed himself to be open to optimism. And I felt frankly envious of Matt, because as an Israeli, I don't have that luxury. And just how cautious we need to be in relation to the Islamist movements that are rising into the void of the Arab Spring was brought home by a small article that I saw in the last couple days on the Daily Alert. Some of you, no doubt, received the Daily Alert. And it's a daily compendium of articles about Israel and the Middle East. And there was a small piece in the Daily Alert which noted that the leader of this new moderate Tunisian Islamist movement was quoted a few months ago as referring to Israel as a germ in the Middle East, which must be erased, removed. And he further noted that Sheikh Yassin, the late leader of Hamas, had at one point predicted Israel's demise within the next quarter of a century, and this moderate leader of the moderate Islamist Tunisian movement said that he thinks Sheikh Yassin's predictions need to be lowered, and that in fact Israel is likely to disappear far sooner than that. So that the world as it looks, the region as it looks from Jerusalem, is very much that view that I had on the morning of Gilad Shalit's release. It is the green flag of jihadism waving in every direction, and somehow, even some of our closest friends, even some of the smartest observers, like Matt Kaminsky, are either missing what we're seeing or perhaps minimizing or even dismissing the significance of what, frankly, terrifies us. A poll was taken recently in Israel asking the following question: which of Israel's existential threats most worries you? And the list included a nuclear Iran, the resumption of terrorism, the rise of Islamism around the Arab world. And what struck me were two things. One is there is no other country in the world that would conduct a poll with that question. And not only to ask, are you afraid for the survival of your country, but you get multiple choices. Which existential threat keeps you awake most at night? And the final notable point here was that there wasn't a single percentage among the respondents who had no reply. Everyone had their favorite existential threat. And that's what living in Israel means, today in particular. I've been living in Israel now for nearly 30 years. We've had highs and lows. It's been an incredible and thrilling roller coaster ride. But I don't recall a period of existential dread that resembles this time now. I came of age, and I think many of you here did as well, aware of Israel and connected to Israel in those terrible weeks before the Six-Day War, the weeks known in Israel as Tkufat HaHamtana, the waiting period, when Israel was in the active process of waiting and preparing for war. And I don't think that Israel has experienced quite another time that more closely resembles May 1967, in a much more subtle and protracted way. May 1967 was immediate. We were dealing with existential threat in terms of weeks and days, and now it's a process of months and even several years. Nevertheless, I believe that we are in a Tkufat Hamtana. We are in a waiting period, and there is a countdown to what I think and many Israelis believe is an unavoidable regional clash between Israel and the rising forces of Islamism, Iran, and its allies. In many ways, Israel today is incomparably stronger than it was in May 1967. Militarily, of course, economically, you all are well familiar with the great economic success story of Israel. 8 universities, every one of them listed in surveys of the world's top 500 universities. My own personal favorite measure of Israeli achievement is that we now export goat cheese to France. So the list of Israeli achievements is truly extraordinary. In one crucial way, though, we are much weaker today than we were in May 1967, and that concerns what both Seth and David spoke about, which is the assault on Israel's legitimacy. The erosion of Israel's legitimacy, the growing erosion of our legitimacy around the world, is, I would argue, the outermost circle of threat. It is, in some sense, the least tangible of the threats facing Israel, on the one hand. On the other hand, I believe that in the long term, it is the greatest threat facing Israel and the Jewish people. And the reason I believe that is because the core of Jewish existence, the core of Jewish identity, is the Jewish story. We are who we are as a people because of a story that we have told ourselves for thousands of years about who we are. If the return to Zion is evil or a lie, then the Jewish story is a lie, is evil. That is what we are fighting for today. We are fighting for the integrity of a millennia-old story. I think we need to try to understand more deeply what the nature of this threat is, what its roots are, and what its expressions are. There are different facets to delegitimization. And for me, a shorthand definition of the difference between legitimate criticism of Israel and delegitimization of Israel is the difference between 1967 and 1948. Criticizing the consequences of 1967 is part of a legitimate discourse on Israel. We debate that all the time in Israel itself, and one can't fault those who engage in one way or another with that debate, whether or not one agrees with those positions. But debating the consequences of 1948, which is to say the creation of a Jewish state, that is the definition of delegitimization. Another way of understanding how delegitimization works is by the obsessive nature of criticism of Israel. And here I certainly include the obsessive nature of criticism of Israel relating to 1967 as well as 1948. And the UN is a very useful model for understanding how delegitimization works. If the UN were to criticize Israel more than any other country in the world, that would be obscene. In fact, the UN criticizes Israel more than all other countries combined. That is no longer hatred, that is a pathological obsession. And that brings us to an anti-Semitic moment, a recognizable anti-Semitic moment. Now, there are some who say, including within the Jewish community, and you all know we're hearing these voices more and more prominently. And these voices say that we ourselves are largely to blame for the growing assault on Israel's legitimacy, Israel's policies, the settlements, the occupation. We are bringing delegitimization onto ourselves. Now, I personally favor a settlement freeze. Sorry, Josh. And an unconditional, open-ended settlement freeze for several reasons, and perhaps the most basic reason is to remove the settlement issue from the table and to remind our friends, never mind our enemies and those who oppose us, to remind our friends and to remind ourselves, remind the Jewish community, that the settlements are not the reason for the absence of peace. To insist that the settlements are the main obstacle to peace is to engage in a kind of self-willed amnesia. We have the phenomenon of Holocaust denial in much of the Muslim world. Within the Jewish community, we have a growing phenomenon that can be called Second Intifada denial. Denial of what happened in the year 2000, beginning at Camp David, moving to Israel's acceptance in December 2000 of the Clinton proposals. Yasser Arafat's counter-offer, 4 years of suicide bombings. It is denial of the Gaza withdrawal and its consequences, what happens when Israel actually uproots settlements and moves to an international border. So that to cite the settlements or any Israeli policy, whether one agrees with those policies or not, as the root cause, the main obstacle to a successful peace agreement is to distort and deny history. Delegitimization tends to focus on 2 areas. The first is Israel's right to defend itself, and the second is Israel's right to define itself. The assault on Israel's right to defend itself takes the form of transforming any Israeli act of war, even an act of war in self-defense, into an inherent war crime. And parenthetically, I think it's important in trying to understand the Israeli political psyche today to go back to the Gaza war of 2009. Many Israelis, including myself, passionately supported the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, not because we believed that it would end the missile strikes from Gaza into Israel, but because we believed that when inevitably we would need to go back into Gaza to defend ourselves, we would have the international legitimacy to do so from the 1967 lines. That is what we learned in 2009 as was a profound illusion. And in 2009, when we went back into Gaza and found ourselves branded as a war criminal, as a war criminal state, that was the moment when unilateralism as an option died in Israel. The second facet of the delegitimization assault on Israel is philosophically, I believe, the heart of why there is no peace today. And that is the assault on Israel's right to define itself as a Jewish state, or as the homeland of the Jewish people, if one prefers that definition. And the underlying principle in denying the right of Israel to define itself as a Jewish state is the notion that the Jews are not a nation or a people, but a religion. And this is an assumption that you hear throughout the Arab world. And what you hear from Arabs, you certainly hear it across the spectrum among Palestinians, but also widely through the Middle East, is that we, the Arab world, know the Jews as a religious minority who lived under us, under the benign protection of Islam, as they'll put it, for many centuries. And it was only in the late 19th century that the Jews began to redefine themselves as a nation. And we, the Arab world, are not prepared to accept this new bogus identity. if you want to live again as a religious minority under our benign protection, you're welcome. That's what you'll hear very often in the Arab world. Now that, of course, is based on a profound distortion of how Jews have always perceived themselves. From biblical times, we have seen ourselves as Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. We are a people with a particular religious identity, which means that peoplehood is the ground from which Judaism grows. In that sense, when we speak of the three monotheistic faiths, Judaism operates a little bit differently. The notion of a Muslim atheist or a Christian atheist is simply an oxymoron. As soon as a Christian or Muslim stops believing in the basic tenets of his or her faith, they are no longer Muslim or Christian. In Judaism, we have, Baruch Hashem, many Jewish atheists. And what seems to be a contradiction, an anomaly to outsiders, is, I think, readily understood among Jews, whether we like the phenomenon of Jewish atheists or not. If you, as a Jew, as a Jewish atheist, nevertheless identify with the Jewish people, with the Jewish story, you defend the Jewish people, you raise your children with Jewish values, you are, depending on who you ask, a Jew in reasonably good standing. Your basic Jewishness is certainly not called into question. And the reason for that, I think it's a fascinating philosophical discussion in its own right. One can simply say, very briefly, that Judaism is different from Islam and Christianity because Judaism is a particularist faith as opposed to the universal faiths of Christianity and Islam, which aim to remake the world in its literal image. Judaism operates differently in the sense that we see ourselves as being a kind of spiritual avant-garde moving through history. We have no expectation of remaking the world entirely in our image. And because we are a particularist faith, we need a people to carry this faith. So peoplehood is not only a legitimate part of Jewish identity, it is in fact an essential religious category. There is no Judaism without the Jewish people, which is why a Jewish state makes perfect sense, is in fact, in some sense, a prerequisite for the ultimate fulfillment of Judaism in a way that really makes no sense to Christianity and Islam. Now, I understand why this is complicated for Muslims and also, frankly, many Christians. When one engages in interreligious dialogue, you repeatedly come against this wall of incomprehension on the part of Christians and Muslims about the place of peoplehood and the role of statehood in Jewish religious identity. Nevertheless, what the Arab world is doing in denying our right to define ourselves as a people is denying exactly what it expects of Israel to do in relation to the Palestinians. We are supposed to affirm the right of the Palestinians to define themselves as a nation. And in fact, today, a strong majority of Israelis do precisely that. The old Israeli attitude, which was embodied by Golda Meir in the early 70s, who said there's no such thing as a Palestinian people, you'll find very few Israelis today who will repeat that. Most of us today accept, however painfully, the idea that this is a conflict between two national narratives and that we are fated to share this land in one form or another between these two competing forces. The asymmetry that is built in today to the conflict is that a majority of Israelis have made the psychological breakthrough to accepting the premise that this is a conflict between two legitimate national identities, while on the Arab side, not just the Palestinian side, throughout the Arab world, there has been no reciprocal breakthrough. In fact, I would say that even Palestinian moderates, with very few exceptions, have not yet made the most minimal attempt to try to understand us as a people. And the most recent example of that was an article that appeared on the English language website of Al Jazeera, written by Sari Nusseibeh, the president of Al-Quds University, a leading Palestinian moderate, and I say in his case, moderate without quotation marks. Sari Nusseibeh is the only Palestinian leader to call on the Palestinian national movement to give up the dream, our nightmare, of a mass return of refugees to the state of Israel, and that the descendants of refugees will all have to go to a Palestinian state. For saying that, Nusseibeh had to flee Jerusalem for 2 years and live in London. So even Sari Nusseibeh, who's gone farther in reaching out to Israel than almost any Palestinian, in this article in Al Jazeera said explicitly, we cannot accept the notion of Israel as a Jewish state because the Jews are a religion and not, or at best an ethnicity, he said, and not a people or a nation. Sari Nusseibeh is engaging in peoplehood denial. The root of the conflict today, the reason that there is no peace, is because the Arab world in general and the Palestinian national movement in all of its forms, Islamist and nationalist, Fatah and Hamas, all agree that the Jews are a religion rather than a people and have no right to self-determination. That is, in one line, that is the root of the cause of the absence of peace, the assault on our right to define ourselves. Now, is delegitimization anti-Semitism? I mentioned earlier in passing that the UN's pathological obsession with Israel is an example of classical anti-Semitism, and I'd like to unpack that a little bit. Obviously, not all of those who are involved in the delegitimization movement are anti-Semites. Even some of the Jews involved are not anti-Semites. But this is, I believe, a resurgence of classical anti-Semitism. What classical anti-Semitism always did was to identify the Jew with all of those loathsome qualities that a given civilization most objected to. So that under Christianity for 2,000 years until Vatican II in 1965, under Christianity, the Jew as Christ killer. Under Islam, the Jew as murderer of the prophets. That is a Muslim term. Under communism, the Jew as capitalist. Under Nazism, the Jew as race polluter. And today, in the era of human rights, as a secular faith, the new secular faith, Israel as the arch violator of human rights, Israel as the symbol of colonialism and militarism. Delegitimization works differently in the Muslim world than it does in the West. In the Muslim world, the delegitimization is overt and crass in the sense that it is an assault on the basic facts of Jewish history. It is a denial, I would call it a culture of denial that is taking deep root in large parts of the Muslim world, that denies the most basic truths of Jewish history. There was no ancient Jewish presence in the land of Israel. The Bible is a Zionist myth. There was no temple on the Temple Mount. Yasser Arafat said that to Bill Clinton at Camp David in July 2000. The Holocaust, of course, is either an outright fabrication or an exaggeration. When Mahmoud Abbas appeared recently at the UN General Assembly, and I urge you all to read that speech very carefully, it's an important contemporary document of the conflict, Abbas referred to the religious roots of the Holy Land. He spoke about Jesus in the Holy Land, he spoke about the Prophet Muhammad, and he left out any mention of the Jews. Now that omission was obviously deliberate, because the most natural figure to evoke would be Abraham, the father, the literal father or spiritual father of the three monotheistic faiths. To mention Abraham, though, would have forced Abbas to acknowledge a Jewish connection to the land as well. And Abbas simply erased us from the Holy Land. In the West, denial, except on the far-right fringes of the Holocaust denial phenomenon, denial focuses not on the facts of Jewish history, but on their meaning. And the aim of the denial movement, the delegitimization movement in the West, is to portray the Jewish story as sinister. The Jewish recovery from the Shoah, the return to Zion, was not a great moment of the triumph of the human spirit, but quite the opposite. It is the expression of colonialism and aggression against the Third World. The Shoah itself is increasingly turned against us in the West, and several ways. One is by trivializing the Shoah, by comparing the Shoah to other atrocities, and more insidiously by, in effect, accusing the Jews of betraying the Shoah, of betraying our own history, and implicitly accusing Israel and Israel's alleged crimes as of having greater offense precisely because we as the victims should have known better. That is a very powerful motif running through the delegitimization movement. Delegitimization threatens the great Jewish victory of the post-Holocaust era. American Jewry, working together with Israel, made a kind of implicit alliance based on the assumption that the Jews need to rejoin the community of nations as a collective. American Jewry and Israel, working together in the post-Holocaust years, defeated the two consequences of the Shoah: powerlessness and the Nazi attempt to exclude the Jews from humanity. The Zionist argument was that this is, in fact, the moment when the Jews need to rejoin the community of nations. And bear in mind that Zionism was not only about returning the Jews to the land, but always about returning the Jews as well to the community of nations. Zionism, in effect, was a two-pronged return. Now, there was another Jewish strategy in 1945, another survivalist strategy, which was the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox strategy. And the ultra-Orthodox argument was that what Jews need to do is what they always did, which is one community is destroyed, you simply create the exact replica somewhere else, and you build your walls, your physical or spiritual walls, as high as possible. That, of course, is an anti-Zionist approach, anti-Zionist in the most basic worldview in terms of our relationship with the rest of humanity. And the Zionist argument was that if separatism, if Jewish ghettoization was offensive, was wrong in the past, it has, since the Shoah, become untenable. What is happening today with the growth of the delegitimization movement is an attempt to beat back this great Jewish post-war victory. The attempt is being made today to re-ghettoize the Jewish collective. And there is a kind of unholy alliance at work between the delegitimizers of Israel, implicitly, and those in our midst who favor a form of radical Jewish separatism from the rest of the world. And you hear it in Israel on the Haredi radio stations, over and over again, Am levadad yishkon, a nation that shall dwell alone. Bilam's curse from the Bible. Haredim, of course, don't see that as a curse, but as a blessing. So that the delegitimizers are feeding into this theological separatism and, in a sense, encouraging it, validating it. This is the struggle that we are facing today. Now, how should the Jewish people respond to this assault on our post-Holocaust victory? I'd like to, for a moment, address the left-wing part of the Jewish community and then the right-wing part of the Jewish community. The left needs to take delegitimization seriously. It needs to stop dismissing delegitimization as a consequence of the occupation and understand that we are once again in another pathological moment in Jewish history. The left needs as well to stop flirting with the delegitimizers. The New Israel Fund, which I feel in many ways does wonderful work in Israel, nevertheless failed utterly in its response to the accusations, which turned out to be true, that it was funding NGOs in Israel that actively promote delegitimization. At first, the New Israel Fund denied it outright. Then it tried to impugn the motives of its critics. Finally, it issued new guidelines, and to this day, I think there are questions about how those guidelines are being implemented. And that is a direct function of a widespread attitude on the Jewish left, including the Zionist left, that doesn't take delegitimization seriously. Now, turning to the right. The right needs to understand that Israeli democracy and the institutions of Israeli democracy are our greatest weapons in fighting delegitimization. The assault against the Israeli Supreme Court, and one can debate the extent of the court's activism and the court's reach. That is a legitimate topic for debate. But there's a much deeper assault going on against the legitimacy of secular law in the state of Israel. There is a deep assault against the Israeli media. There is Haaretz. There are also other facets to the Israeli media. And we need to begin to cherish the institutions of Israeli democracy as our national assets in affirming Israel's place in the West. And I think we have to realize that our place in the West is not indefinitely secure. Israel is in a very strange anomaly. We are the only country in the world, the only democracy, I should say rather, the only democracy that is also an occupier. And at the same time, we're the only country in the world whose neighbors have placed it under a permanent death threat. Those are the two conditions, the two contradictory conditions in which Israel lives. In order for us to continue to win sympathy and to be able to deal with the death threat that hangs over us, we need to, as much as possible, minimize the negative consequences of the occupation, especially given the fact that there is no chance in the short term of ending the occupation. There is no partner on the other side for ending the occupation. That means that we need to do whatever we can to strengthen the institutions of Israeli democracy, because that is what will help us get through the next period. And finally, I think the right has to exercise far more national responsibility than it has. It needs to refrain from raising incendiary bills in the Knesset, most of which have not been passed and have no chance of being passed. I'm speaking about Avigdor Lieberman's bills, and which only add fuel to the delegitimization campaign. We need to fight for the post-Holocaust achievement of affirming our place in the community of nations, and that requires a far more serious commitment, both on the part of the left and the right. There is some good news, believe it or not. I didn't believe it either, but I actually looked into it. We've had a number of victories in the last few months that I think are worth mentioning. Worth mentioning because in our struggle, we need to remind ourselves that this is a cause that is definitely winnable. In the last months, we saw a boycott by almost all democratic countries of the UN's 10th anniversary Durban reunion. We saw the strange trajectory of Judge Goldstone, which is playing out again in these last days. I don't know how many of you saw his op-ed in the New York Times. My own feeling about Goldstone is that there is no one who has done greater damage in recent years to the good name of Israel and the Jewish people. And if he, for whatever reason, is trying to atone, then I accept the beginnings of that process. But as far, I think, as most of us are concerned, he is very much on probation. There were two laws that were passed in England and in Belgium, both giving local courts jurisdiction over foreigners accused of war crimes. In practice, these were laws that were aimed at Israelis. Both of these laws have recently been rescinded. That means Tzipi Livni can actually go shopping in London now. The UN shocked us recently by issuing the Palmer Commission report, which not only largely vindicated Israel over the flotilla, but legitimized our siege of Gaza as both legal and ethical. This is really an extraordinary moment. Most of all, what gives me faith in our ultimate victory is that we have begun to fight back. We, meaning world Jewry. And I remember those terrible days, Seth, that you talked about in 2001, 2002. And I would come to the States in those years and speak. And even within Jewish communities, I would find a measure of emotional distance or incomprehension of what we were going through in Israel. And I would repeatedly be asked the question of, well, what will it take to make a deal with the Palestinians? How close are we? Isn't it true that at Taba we were just days away from signing a deal? And there was a profound disconnect between what we were experiencing in Israel and the perception of large parts of American Jewry. Today, I find the situation to be much better. And in particular, I see that parts of American Jewry are organizing. I've had the privilege of spending the last 2 days with people from the David Project. We sat today for several hours in the office. And I have to tell you that it was an extraordinary experience for me to see 24 young people, energetic, incredibly savvy, devoting themselves more than full-time to fighting the battle on campus. And that battle has been joined. This is our generation's struggle. And I have no doubt, because of your commitment, I have no doubt that we're going to win. Thank you very much.